Here in the high woods above Harlan County, folks once said Ezra Combs went to his grave in 1953. Turns out they were 40 years early. He walked into these mountains after his family's land was taken and their grave...
How he vanished into the Appalachian wild for decades after burying the 12 men who took his son. They found his cabin in 2003, hidden so deep in the mountains of Harlan County that the surveyors who discovered it believed they had stumbled upon ruins from a century-long past. But the man inside was not a relic. He was 89 years old, had been living alone in the wilderness for 52 years, and had personally buried 12 men in graves they had dug themselves before retreating into terrain that had concealed him for half a century. This is the true story of the father who became a ghost. Our story begins in the remote mountain section of Harlan County, Kentucky, in the heart of what locals called Bloody Harlan, during the desperate years of the early 1950s, when the coal companies ruled with authority that no government could challenge. The mountains rise here in great folds of sandstone and coal-bearing shale, their hollows sheltering families who had lived according to their own laws since before the nation's founding, who understood that when the law failed you, you became the law yourself. You see, in Harlan County during the years of our story, the coal mines consumed men the way fire consumes wood, constantly, hungrily, without regard for what was destroyed in the process. The companies needed labor, and when willing workers were scarce, they found other ways to fill the quotas that profits demanded. Debt bondage, false imprisonment, forced labor. These were the tools that kept the mines running when legitimate employment could not provide sufficient bodies to feed the darkness underground. The man at the center of our story was born Ezra Nathaniel Combs in 1914, in a cabin that overlooked the hollow where his family had lived since 1798. He had survived the Depression as a young man, had fought across the Pacific during the war, had returned to the mountains that had always been his home, with skills and experiences that he hoped to never use again. He was 37 years old in the autumn of 1951, a man whose quiet exterior concealed depths that his circumstances would soon reveal. That's right, Ezra Combs stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, had dark hair that was just beginning to show threads of gray, possessed eyes that were the deep brown of mountain earth, and that seemed to hold knowledge that exceeded his years. His body was powerful from decades of mountain labor. His hands were calloused from work that had shaped him since childhood. His movements carried an efficiency that his time in the Marines had refined into something approaching lethal precision. His son was named Daniel, 15 years old in the autumn of 1951, a boy who was becoming the man his father had always hoped he would be. Daniel had his father's build, already stood 5 feet 10 inches tall, possessed the same quiet determination that had defined Combs' men for generations. He was strong for his age, capable for his age, noticeable for his age, and in Harlan County in 1951, being noticeable could be dangerous. Ezra's wife had died 3 years before, taken by a fever that the nearest doctor had been too far away to treat. Since then, father and son had built a life together that asked nothing from the outside world except to be left alone. They worked their land, hunted their hollow, maintained their independence with the same fierce determination that had characterized Combs' men since the family had first arrived in these mountains. The trouble that would destroy this family began with a debt that Ezra did not owe and had never incurred. The company store system that dominated Harlan County had been corrupted for decades, had developed methods for creating debts that workers had never actually accumulated. False ledgers, fabricated purchases, invented charges. These were the tools that kept men bound to the mines long after they should have been free. A company agent named Vernon Crawford had identified the Combs property as valuable for timber rights that the family had never agreed to sell. When offers failed, Crawford turned to methods that the company had used before. He created a debt in Ezra's name, a fabricated ledger that showed purchases never made, charges never incurred, a balance that legitimate earnings could never repay. The warrant that Crawford obtained gave him authority to collect the debt through any means necessary, including the seizure of property and the conscription of family members into company labor. It was this second provision that Crawford intended to use, not against Ezra, who was too old and too capable to be taken easily, but against Daniel, who was young and strong and whose labor could be extracted for years before age diminished his value. The taking came on the morning of October 15, 1951. Ezra had traveled to Harlan the day before to file papers contesting the fraudulent debt, papers that the company's influence would ensure never reached a judge. The timing of the taking had been calculated to ensure his absence, to prevent complications that a combat veteran might have created. Daniel was working in the field when they arrived, 12 men in a company truck armed with weapons that legitimate debt collection would never have required. Crawford led them, carried papers that purported to authorize what they were about to do, spoke with the confidence of a man who had done this many times before. "Daniel Combs," Crawford announced, stepping from the truck with deputies spreading out behind him. "You're being taken into custody for debt owed by your father to the Harlan Coal Company. You'll work in the mines until the debt is satisfied. Resistance will be considered an additional offense." Daniel's eyes searched the hollow for his father, searched for the man who had always protected him, who had always been there when danger approached. His father was not there. His father was miles away, fighting a legal battle that the company had already ensured he would lose. "My pa don't owe no debt," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the fear that his heart must have contained. "We never bought nothing from no company store. You got the wrong family." Crawford smiled, an expression that held no warmth. "The ledger says otherwise, boy, and the law says you work until the ledger is clear. Now you can come quiet or you can come hard. Either way, you're coming." Daniel did not resist. He was 15 years old, alone, facing 12 armed men whose intentions he could not have fought regardless of his father's training. He was seized, his hands bound behind his back with rope that cut into his wrists, thrown into the back of the truck like cargo rather than a human being. "Pa!" Daniel shouted as the truck began to move, shouted toward the empty hollow where he hoped his father might somehow hear. "Pay, they're taking me." "Pa!" His shouts echoed off the ridges that surrounded the hollow, carried across terrain that had witnessed Combs' struggles since 1798. But his father was not there to hear them. His father was in Harlan filing papers that would never matter, while his son was transported to a mine that would become his prison and his grave. The mine was called Black Hollow No. 7, a pit that had earned its reputation through decades of deaths that the company had never adequately acknowledged. The conditions underground were lethal: inadequate ventilation, insufficient supports, equipment that should have been replaced years before. Men died in Black Hollow with regularity that the company considered acceptable, that the families they left behind considered murder. The entrance to Black Hollow was a wound in the mountainside, a dark mouth that swallowed men each morning and sometimes refused to give them back. The air inside was thick with coal dust that coated lungs and blackened skin, that created conditions where breathing itself became a form of slow suffocation. The tunnels extended nearly a mile into the mountain, grew narrower and more dangerous the deeper they went, reached into darkness that lanterns could barely penetrate. Daniel was assigned to the deepest section, to tunnels where the most dangerous work was performed by those the company valued least. He was given a pick that weighed more than his arms could comfortably swing, was shown walls of coal that he was expected to break apart and load into carts, was told that his quota was 100 pounds per hour and that failure to meet quota would result in punishment. He was 15 years old. He had never been underground before. He had never held a mining pick. He had never experienced darkness so complete that his hand disappeared when he held it before his face. Daniel was put to work immediately, given tasks that exceeded what his 15-year-old body should have been required to perform. He worked 16-hour shifts in tunnels, where the air was thick with dust that coated his lungs. He pushed carts that weighed more than he did, swung picks at walls that his arms could barely lift against. He slept in a barracks that provided no comfort, ate food that provided no nutrition. The other miners, men who had been in Black Hollow for years, who had seen boys like Daniel come and go, watched with eyes that held pity but not hope. They had seen this before. They knew how it ended. Some tried to help him, showed him techniques that would reduce the strain on his body, gave him portions of their own meager rations. But they could not protect him from the foreman, from the quota system, from a company that viewed workers as resources to be consumed rather than people to be protected. He was not paid, The company claimed his labor was repayment for a debt his father had never incurred. He was not free to leave. Guards at the entrance ensured that workers remained until the company decided they could go. He was, in every way that mattered, a slave, a 15-year-old boy working in conditions that would have been illegal had anyone cared enough to enforce the laws that existed. The foreman of Black Hollow was a man named Silas Burke, whose cruelty had been documented in complaints that the company had consistently ignored. Burke had discovered that Daniel was the son of a man who had refused to sell timber rights, had determined that the boy would be punished for his father's defiance. The punishment would serve as a message to other families who might consider similar resistance. The beatings began on Daniel's third day. Daniel had failed to meet quota, had loaded only 73 pounds in an hour instead of the required 100, and Burke had determined that failure required correction. The correction came in the form of a leather strap applied to Daniel's back, while two other men held him against a support beam. "Your daddy thinks he's too good to do business with the company," Burke said between strokes of the strap. "You're going to learn that nobody's too good for this mine. You're going to learn what happens to families that don't cooperate." The lash marks that would be found on Daniel's body told the story of punishment that exceeded what any infraction could have justified. His back was striped with welts that opened and bled, that became infected in conditions where cleanliness was impossible, that would leave scars if he had lived long enough to heal. His fingers were broken on the 8th day when he dropped a cart handle and spilled coal that had to be recollected. Burke supervised the punishment personally, held Daniel's hand against a rock, while another man brought a hammer down on fingers that had held his father's hand just weeks before. "Maybe now you'll remember to hold on tight," Burke said, while Daniel screamed, while fingers that would never fully heal cracked under the hammer's weight. "Maybe now you'll understand what happens when you disappoint me." He was denied food as additional punishment, denied the already inadequate rations that the company provided, forced to work on an empty stomach that his teenage body could not sustain. He was denied water, forced to drink from puddles that collected on the tunnel floor, water that was contaminated with coal dust and worse. He was denied rest, forced to work double shifts when Burke determined that his performance was inadequate. Daniel wrote a letter to his father during the second week, scratched words onto paper that another miner had given him, words that would never be delivered because the company intercepted all correspondence from workers who had not yet satisfied their debts. "Dear Pa," the letter read. It would be found in company records 52 years later, evidence that Ezra would never see until his son had been dead for half a century. "I don't know if you'll ever get this. They say I can't send letters until the debt is paid, but another man said he'd try to get this out. Pa, it's bad here, real bad. The foreman beats me when I don't meet quota. My fingers are broke and they didn't set them right. My back hurts from the strap. I try to work hard, but I'm not strong enough yet. The other men help when they can, but they're scared of Burke too. I keep thinking you'll come for me. I know you will. I know you're looking for me right now. I just have to hold on until you find me. I love you, Pa. I love you more than I ever said. Tell Mama's grave that I miss her. Tell her I'm trying to be brave like she always wanted me to be. Your son, Daniel." The letter was filed in company records, was marked as intercepted, not delivered, was forgotten until investigators found it 52 years later. Ezra never knew his son had written to him. Daniel never knew his words had not reached the father he believed would save him. He endured 3 weeks of this existence, 3 weeks of labor that exceeded what his body could sustain. 3 weeks of beatings that added injury to exhaustion. 3 weeks of darkness underground that his 15 years of life in mountain sunlight had not prepared him to endure. The collapse came on November 5, 1951, 3 weeks after Daniel had been taken. A support beam that should have been replaced years before finally surrendered to pressure that it could no longer bear, brought down a section of tunnel that contained 17 workers, including Daniel Combs, whose body would not be recovered for another 4 days. The collapse began with a sound that survivors would describe as like nothing they had ever heard, a groaning of wood and stone that seemed to come from the mountain itself, a protest against the wounds that decades of mining had inflicted. The sound lasted perhaps 3 seconds before the tunnel simply ceased to exist, before tons of rock and timber came down on men, who had no time to run and nowhere to run if they had. Daniel was working in the deepest section of the affected area, was loading coal into a cart when the collapse began. He heard the groaning, saw the support beam above him begin to buckle, felt the first stones falling around him. He dropped the cart and ran toward the entrance, toward the light that represented everything the mine was not, toward a father he believed would be waiting for him if he could only reach the surface. He almost made it. He had covered perhaps 20 feet when the main collapse caught him, when the ceiling came down in a cascade of rock and timber that buried everything beneath it. He was struck by a beam that pinned his legs, was covered by rubble that pressed down on his back, was buried in darkness so complete that his open eyes could see nothing at all. He was not killed instantly. The rubble had fallen in a way that created a small pocket of air around his head and chest, a space perhaps 2 feet high and 3 feet long, enough to breathe, enough to survive, enough to call for help that would not come in time. Survivors who were rescued from the periphery of the collapse reported hearing voices in the darkness for nearly 2 days, voices that called for help, voices that called for fathers and mothers, voices that gradually faded into silence that the mountain eventually imposed. Daniel's voice was among them. His name was identified by those who could hear him. His words were remembered by those who survived to report what they had heard. A miner named Thomas Adkins, who had been trapped 50 feet from Daniel, but in a section where rescue was possible, would testify 52 years later about what he had heard in the darkness. "I could hear the boy clear as day," Adkins would say, his voice still breaking after half a century. He was calling for his daddy. "Just Daddy, help me," over and over. At first he was strong, like he really believed someone was coming. He kept saying, "I know you're looking for me, Daddy. I know you'll find me." It broke my heart to hear it. "Daddy," Daniel called in the darkness, his voice carrying through gaps in the rubble that would not permit rescue. "Daddy, help me. I can't move. My legs are stuck. It hurts so bad, Daddy. It's dark. It's so dark in here. Please come get me, please." The calling continued through the first day. Those who heard it described a voice that maintained hope even as the hours accumulated, that believed rescue would come because a son believes his father will always save him. That called Daddy, with the faith of a child who has never been failed by the man he trusted most. Daniel talked about his life during the long hours when calling produced no response. He talked about fishing with his father in the creek behind their cabin. He talked about learning to shoot, about setting traps, about all the things that fathers and sons do together in mountains that have known their families for generations. "Remember when we went hunting last fall, Daddy?" Daniel said to darkness that held no one who could answer. "You said I was getting good. You said I'd be as good as you someday. I wanted to make you proud, Daddy. I tried real hard in the mine. I tried to meet quota even though it hurt. I wanted you to be proud of me when you came to get me." "I know you're coming, Daddy," Daniel said during the second day, his voice weaker now, his hope beginning to fade. "I know you'll find me. You always find me when I'm lost. Remember when I got lost hunting and you found me? You said you'd always find me." "I'm waiting, Daddy. I'm waiting for you." The calling stopped approximately 36 hours after the collapse. Those who had been listening, trapped themselves but further from the worst damage, reported that the voice simply faded, became quieter and quieter until it was no longer distinguishable from silence. The last word anyone heard from Daniel Combs was Daddy, spoken so softly that only the darkness could hear it clearly. "He just stopped," Adkins would testify, tears streaming down weathered cheeks. 1 minute he was talking, telling his daddy he loved him, and then he just stopped. The silence after that was the worst thing I ever heard. I've heard that silence in my dreams for 50 years. I'll hear it until I die. Daniel Combs was 15 years old, had been taken from his home 3 weeks before by men enforcing a debt his father had never owed, had died in darkness, calling for a father who had not known where he was. He had called for 36 hours, had maintained faith until the end, had died believing that his father was coming for him. Ezra learned of Daniel's death on November 9, 1951, 4 days after the collapse, when the company sent a representative to inform him that his debt had been partially satisfied by his son's labor, and that the remaining balance would still need to be addressed. The representative delivered this information as though it were a routine matter, as though a 15-year-old boy's death was merely an accounting adjustment. As though a father's grief was irrelevant to the business of collecting debts that had never existed, Ezra did not speak during the delivery of this information. He simply listened, and when the representative had finished, he asked a single question. "Where is my son's body?" The representative explained that Daniel had been buried in a company cemetery, that the burial had already occurred, that Ezra would not be permitted to visit the grave until the remaining debt was satisfied. That night, Ezra traveled to the company cemetery and found his son's grave, an unmarked mound in a field of unmarked mounds. He dug through the night, unearthed a pine box that contained what remained of Daniel, held his son's broken body until dawn lightened the eastern sky. The body told the story of Daniel's final weeks more clearly than any words could have. Bruises that had not come from the collapse, lash marks across the back, fingers broken and healing incorrectly. Evidence that the 3 weeks Daniel had spent in the mine had included suffering that exceeded what the labor alone would have produced. Ezra carried Daniel's body back to the hollow, buried his son on a ridge overlooking the land that should have been his inheritance. He worked through an entire day, created a resting place worthy of the boy he had raised. "I'm going to find every man who took you from me," Ezra said to the earth that held his son. "Every man who was in that truck. I'm going to make each one dig his own grave. And then I'm going to bury them the way they buried you, without ceremony, without markers, without anyone knowing where they lie." He identified them systematically, the 12 men who had been in the truck that morning. Crawford was the leader, but 11 others had participated, had made themselves part of the crime that had ended Daniel's life. The campaign began on December 15, 1951. The method reflected the burial his son had received. Each victim would dig his own grave, would understand why he was digging, would experience the labor that preceded his end. Ezra had spent the month between Daniel's burial and the beginning of his campaign in careful preparation. He had identified each of the 12 men who had been in the truck that morning, had learned their routines and residences, had mapped the approaches and escape routes that his work would require. His Marine training had taught him how to plan operations that required precision, how to execute objectives against targets that might be protected, how to disappear after action in ways that pursuit could not follow. The first man was James Tackett, who had bound Daniel's hands that morning. Ezra had watched Tackett for 3 days, had learned that the man lived alone in a cabin at the edge of town, had identified the path through forest that would allow approach without detection. He took Tackett in the early hours of December 15th, entered the cabin while the man slept, subdued him with techniques that the Marines had taught and that civilian life had never required him to use. Tackett woke to find himself bound, gagged, being transported through darkness toward a destination he could not identify. Ezra took him to a location deep in the forest, a clearing that no trail approached and that no one would have reason to visit. He removed Tackett's gag, provided him with a shovel, and spoke his first words since the taking had begun. "Dig," Ezra said, his voice carrying the flatness that had replaced all emotion. 6 feet deep, 3 feet wide, 7 feet long. You helped take my son. You helped put him in the ground. Now you dig your own place in it. Tackett's face showed recognition first, then fear, then the desperation of a man who understood what was happening but could not accept it. "Combs? Ezra Combs? Listen, I didn't know what would happen. I was just following orders. Crawford said, 'Dig,'" Ezra repeated. "Every minute you spend talking is a minute longer before this ends." Tackett dug through the night while Ezra watched. The work was hard. The ground was winter cold. Resistant to the shovel, reluctant to yield space for the body it would soon hold. Tackett's hands blistered, then bled, then continued working because the alternative was worse. He tried to bargain as he dug, tried to explain, tried to offer information that might save his life. He named the other men who had been present, described Crawford's instructions, confessed details about the company's operations that Ezra already knew. None of it mattered. The digging continued. When the grave was complete, 6 feet deep, 3 feet wide, 7 feet long, exactly the dimensions that Ezra had specified, the talking could finally begin. "Do you remember my son?" Ezra asked, standing at the edge of the grave while Tackett knelt inside it. "Daniel Combs, 15 years old. You bound his hands that morning. You threw him into the truck like he was cargo instead of a child." "I remember," Tackett admitted, his voice cracking with fear. "I remember the boy. I'm sorry, Combs. I'm sorry for what happened." "He died in a mine collapse 3 weeks later," Ezra continued. "He called for me in the darkness for 36 hours. Daddy," he called. "Daddy, help me, it's so dark." He died believing I would come for him. He died thinking I had abandoned him. "Please," Tackett said. "I didn't know. I didn't know he would die. I was just following orders." "You get to call for help until you can't call anymore," Ezra replied. "Maybe someone will hear you, maybe they'll come, the way I came for Daniel." What happened next would be detailed in journals that would not be discovered for 52 years. Tackett was not killed quickly. He was placed in the grave he had dug, was buried in stages that extended his understanding of what was happening. Earth was added gradually, inches at a time, while Tackett remained conscious and aware of each layer that accumulated above him. The first shovelfuls covered his legs, immobilized him in position he could not escape. Tackett screamed, called for help, begged for mercy that the darkness would not provide. Ezra continued shoveling, continued adding earth, continued the burial that justice required. The earth reached Tackett's waist, then his chest, then his shoulders. The weight pressed down on him, made breathing difficult, made each scream require effort that his body could barely provide. He called for help until his voice gave out, called until the earth reached his chin and his mouth, and finally covered everything that remained. The burial took nearly 2 hours to complete. Ezra worked steadily throughout, added earth with the same patience he had taught Daniel when they set snares together, finished the task that justice had demanded he perform. A marker was left where the grave had been dug, a simple stake driven into the ground with words carved into its surface. For Daniel Combs, one of 12. The second man died 4 days later. Robert Lawson had driven the truck that carried Daniel to the mine, had listened to the boy's pleas during the journey, had done nothing. His death matched Tackett's in method, the forced digging, the gradual burial, the marker that documented the count. The grave was located in a different part of the forest, was concealed with the same care, would not be discovered for half a century. The third man died on Christmas Eve, a deputy named William Porter, who had held Daniel while others bound his hands. Ezra felt no compunction about the timing. Daniel had spent his final Christmas in a mine, had received no celebration and no comfort, had died 11 days later in darkness that should have been holiday warmth. Porter would receive the same consideration that Daniel had received. The 4th through 6th men died during January 1952, taken despite the company's attempts to protect them. The company had realized that someone was hunting the men who had participated in Daniel's taking, had attempted to protect them by moving them to different locations, by providing guards, by maintaining vigilance that Ezra's patience consistently defeated. Ezra's marine training allowed him to achieve objectives that superior numbers should have prevented. He had learned to wait on Guadalcanal, to move silently through terrain that enemies believed they controlled. He had learned to strike when opportunity presented itself, to withdraw before response could be mounted. The skills had been intended for war. They served equally well for justice. Each man dug his own grave. Each was buried gradually. Each marker documented the count approaching completion. The graves were scattered across 20 square miles of forest, were hidden in locations that would not be discovered for 52 years, held secrets that only Ezra and the earth would know. Crawford attempted to flee in February. Ezra was waiting where the route required his vehicle to slow. "Do you remember my son?" Ezra asked after Crawford had been subdued. "Daniel Combs, 15 years old. You took him from his home for a debt I never owed. He died calling for me for 36 hours. Crawford tried to explain, tried to offer compensation, tried to blame others. The boy dug coal for 3 weeks, Ezra said. You dig dirt for 1 night. Then you'll understand what he felt when the darkness covered him. Crawford's burial took longer than the others. Ezra ensured he remained conscious for nearly 3 hours, while earth accumulated above him, while the weight increased, while the darkness he had sent Daniel into finally claimed him as well. The marker read, "Vernon Crawford. He took my son." 7 of 12. The remaining 5 men died during February and March. tracked across 3 states, buried in graves they dug themselves. The 12th man died on April 5, 1952, 6 months after Daniel had been taken, 5 months after he had died. The final marker read, "For Daniel Combs, 12 of 12, all debts paid." 12 men buried over 5 months by a father who forced each to dig his own grave, who ensured each understood why the digging was required, who demonstrated that some debts are collected not in labor, but in earth. And then Ezra Combs vanished. He disappeared into the deepest wilderness of Harlan County, into terrain so remote that no trail approached it and no map documented it. His grandfather had shown him the location when he was 12, had explained it was insurance against futures that could not be predicted. That future had arrived. He built a cabin that would serve him for 5 decades, constructed it from timber the wilderness provided. The construction gave purpose to hands that grief might otherwise have made idle. The cabin was small, approximately 14 feet by 14 feet, but it contained everything he needed and nothing that served no purpose. He built a shelf along one wall, a shelf that held the photograph of Daniel that he had saved, the pocket knife that Daniel had carried since his 12th birthday, a lock of hair that Ezra had cut before burying his son. He positioned these items where he could see them from any point in the cabin, where morning light would illuminate them, where they would be the first things he saw when he woke and the last things he saw when he slept. He brought Daniel with him, not physically, but in every way that memory could preserve. The photograph showed Daniel at 14, taken just a year before his death, showed a boy with his father's build and his mother's smile, showed the young man he had been becoming before 12 men in a truck had taken that becoming away. He spoke to Daniel daily, maintained conversations with his son that structured his existence through decades of solitude. The conversations followed patterns that the years refined but never fundamentally changed. "Good morning, son," he would say each day upon waking, looking first at the photograph on the shelf. "Thought I'd check the traps on the North Ridge today. Remember when I taught you to set snares? You got frustrated because the rabbits kept escaping. I told you patience was the most important thing a hunter could have. You learned patience, Daniel. You learned it real good." He would describe his plans for the day, would ask Daniel's opinions about decisions that survival required, would tell his son about the wildlife he had seen and the weather that was coming. "There's a doe with twin fawns that's been coming to the spring each morning," he wrote in a journal entry from 1965. "I told Daniel about them. He would have loved watching them. When he was little, he wanted to raise a fawn as a pet." His mama told him wild things had to stay wild. He cried, but he understood. He always understood things that were bigger than his years. He developed systems for survival that the decades refined and improved. He established gardens in clearings where sunlight reached, grew potatoes and beans and squash that sustained him through seasons when hunting was difficult. He hunted deer and turkey and smaller game that populated the wilderness in abundance that his presence did not diminish. The first years were consumed by grief that the vengeance had delayed but not eliminated. The fury that had sustained him through 5 months of killing faded when the last deputy was buried, was replaced by pain that he had not allowed himself to feel while justice remained incomplete. Now with the killing done and nothing remaining to distract him, he mourned a son whose photograph watched him from the shelf beside his bed. He came close to ending his own life during those early years, came close to joining Daniel in whatever existence awaited beyond death. The rifle he kept for hunting could have ended everything, could have reunited him with the boy whose absence made continuation seem pointless. But something always stopped him. Perhaps it was Daniel's voice in his memory, asking his father not to give up. Perhaps it was the promise he had made at Daniel's grave, to live as a witness to what had been done and what had been answered. Perhaps it was simply inability to surrender to any enemy, even grief. "Not yet, Daniel," he would say when the impulse grew strong. "Not yet. Someone has to remember you. Someone has to tell your story. If I go now, who will remember the boy who called for his daddy in the darkness? I'll come when it's time, but not yet." The decades accumulated with rhythms that the seasons provided. He marked time by the anniversaries that mattered. October 15th, when Daniel had been taken. November 5th, when Daniel had died. Daniel's birthday in March, when he would describe to his son What turning 16 might have been like, what turning 20 might have been like, what becoming a man might have been like. He kept journals throughout his isolation, documented his days and thoughts in notebooks he made from materials the wilderness provided. Daniel would be 40 today, he wrote in an entry from 1976. He'd have a wife by now, children maybe. I'd be a grandfather. Instead, there's just me in this hollow and the conversations I have with a boy who's been gone for 25 years. I miss him every day. The missing doesn't fade. People say time heals, but they're wrong. Time just makes you better at carrying the wound. He wrote about the burials, about the justice he had administered. I buried 12 men for what they did to Daniel. Each one dug his own grave. Each one understood why he was digging before the earth covered him. I don't regret any of it. I'd do it again. A father who doesn't answer what was done to his son is no father at all. By 2003, Ezra was 89 years old, had survived alone for 52 years. Surveyors mapping the wilderness for a conservation project discovered his cabin, found a man whose existence they could not explain. "My name is Ezra Combs," he told the authorities who came to investigate. "In 1951, 12 men took my son Daniel to work in a mine for a debt I never owed. He died 3 weeks later in a collapse, calling for me for 36 hours before the darkness took him. I buried every man who participated. I've been living up here ever since." He was not prosecuted. The statute of limitations had expired decades before. The defendant was 89 years old with health compromised by 52 years of isolation. The prosecutor concluded that prosecution would serve no purpose. Investigators found the 12 graves, found bodies preserved well enough to confirm Ezra's account. Each grave contained a man who had been on the truck that morning in 1951. Each had died in the manner Ezra described, buried gradually in earth they had dug themselves. Ezra died on October 15, 2003, exactly 52 years after Daniel had been taken. He died in a hospital bed, holding the photograph of his son, speaking words to a boy who had been waiting for him for half a century. "I'm coming, Daniel," he said in his final moments. "I'm sorry it took so long. I had to make sure they paid first. I had to make sure you knew I heard you calling. I'm coming now, son. We'll be together again. And this time, no one will ever take you away from me." He was buried beside Daniel, on the ridge overlooking the hollow where Combs' families had lived since 1798. The inscription on his stone reads, "Ezra Nathaniel Combs, 1914-2003. They took his son." He answered. He waited 52 years, together again at last. Beside him, Daniel Combs, 1936-1951, beloved son, 15 years old. He called for his daddy until the darkness came. His daddy heard him. And at the foot of both stones, a son called for 36 hours. A father answered for 52 years, together now, never to be separated again. The songs that emerged from Ezra's story were among the most mournful in modern Appalachian tradition, their subject matter requiring melodies that captured both the horror of a boy dying in darkness and the devotion of a father who spent half a century carrying his memory. The first verse described Daniel before the taking, a 15-year-old boy learning to be a man, walking the land that should have been his inheritance. The melody was warm despite its subject, suggesting a life that should have continued for generations. The second verse described the taking itself, 12 men in a truck, a boy calling for a father who was not there, hands bound with rope that cut into young wrists. The melody darkened, became something that suggested violation, suggested innocence being torn away. The third verse described the mine, the darkness and dust, the beatings and broken fingers, the 3 weeks of suffering that preceded the collapse. The melody became almost unbearable, notes carrying weight that seemed to press down like the earth that would eventually claim the boy. The fourth verse described the collapse and the calling, 36 hours of a voice that maintained faith even as hope faded. Daddy repeated, until the word became silence, and silence became the end. The melody was devastating, was the sound of a son's love meeting a father's absence, was grief crystallized into sound. The fifth verse described the vengeance, 12 men digging their own graves, 12 burials that matched the burial a boy had received in an unmarked company plot. The melody grew fierce and unrelenting, suggesting justice that no badge could prevent, no flight could escape. The sixth verse described the 52 years, a father alone in wilderness that had swallowed him, speaking daily to a photograph that watched from a shelf, keeping company with a son who existed only in memory. The melody softened, became almost tender, suggested love that time could not diminish. The final verse described the reunion, a father dying on the anniversary of his son's taking, speaking words to a boy who had been waiting for 52 years, joining him at last in earth that would hold them forever. The melody resolved into something approaching peace, suggested that some separations are only temporary, no matter how long they last. The song became known as the 36 Hours, and those who heard it often found themselves unable to finish listening. The image of a 15-year-old boy calling for his father in darkness, maintaining hope for 36 hours until his voice simply faded into silence. This was an image that stayed with listeners long after the song ended. Another song focused on the graves themselves, on 12 men forced to dig their own ends, on earth that was added gradually while they called for help that would never come. This song was darker, was closer to justice than to tragedy, was the sound of a father answering what had been done to his son. The chorus of this second song repeated the same words that Ezra had spoken over each grave. For Daniel Combs, for a boy who called for his daddy, for 36 hours of faith that was answered with 52 years of remembrance. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand at the graves where Ezra and Daniel rest together after 52 years of separation, to read the inscriptions that speak of calling and answering and eternal reunion? Would you walk through the wilderness where Ezra survived alone for half a century? Would you try to understand how a father's love could sustain a life through decades of solitude? The journey to the hidden hollow is difficult. Ezra chose it for remoteness that would prevent discovery, but some make the pilgrimage anyway. They come to see the cabin where he survived, to touch the shelf where Daniel's photograph watched over his father's sleep, to understand what it means to love so completely that 52 years of isolation is merely the space between taking and reunion. Some visitors claim to hear voices in the hollow at night, a boy calling Daddy, and a man answering, "I'm here, son, I'm here." Whether these are echoes of memory or products of imagination, those who report them speak of feeling something that approaches peace, something that suggests reunion has been achieved. What about you, my friend? If men took your 15-year-old son to work a debt you never owed, and he died calling for you in the darkness for 36 hours, could you bury 12 men in graves they dug themselves? Could you live alone for 52 years, carrying conversations with a son who existed only in your memory? The mountains don't answer such questions. They simply endure, keeping their secrets and their dead. And some fathers love their sons so completely that 52 years of solitude is merely the space between taking and reunion. And that, my friend, is the true story of how Ezra Combs vanished into the Appalachian wild for decades after burying the 12 men who took his son. A story of love that death could not end, of devotion that time could not diminish, of a father who spent 52 years keeping his son company until death finally let him hear Daniel's voice again. The mountains remember, and through them, so do we all. Thanks for listening to this story, and as always, remember that the hills have eyes and the hollows have memories. Be careful what you do in these mountains, because the mountains never forget, and neither do the fathers who call them home.